Good morning, everyone. We will get started. Welcome to meeting number 46, House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates. We have several witnesses today, all doing opening statements. We'll start with Ms. McIntyre for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Dans le cadre de mes fonctions de sous-secrétaire à la direction,
as part of my duties as a Deputy Secretary for the Policy Program and Protocol Branch at the Office of the Secretary to the Governor-General, or the OSGG, as we are known, I am responsible for the planning and execution of the Governor-General's program. I was also the lead OSGG official accompanying the Governor-General on the visit to the Middle East in March 2022. I'm pleased to appear before this committee again, joined by my colleagues from 4 other government departments to assist with your continued and valued work on the regarding expenses related to official international travel.
Report that, together with our partner departments, some progress has been made in our commitments to the committee. As per the committee's motion, documents were provided detailing expenses associated with the Middle East visit, in addition to a list of official international travel by Governors General since 2014. Our offices have been reviewing how processes can be strengthened and streamlined, and the OSGG has actively participated in the working group on in-flight catering. My colleagues leading this group will speak further to this. J'aimerais profiter de
I'd like to take this opportunity to reiterate that the Governor-General's and the Office's commitment to the responsible use of public funds in all that we do. We understand the serious financial challenges felt by many Canadians. And so, while diplomatic travel is a vital component of the country's international engagement strategy, decisions must always reflect the highest possible standards of stewardship to ensure value for money.
I'd also like to take this opportunity to reiterate that at no time did the Governor-General make any decisions, request any service, or otherwise voiced any preferences about travel, accommodation, catering, or any of the administrative and logistical arrangements discussed here. She understands and respects that accountabilities and responsibilities for these visits and the related budgets reside with public servants and the appropriate government departments involved. I also reiterate that the costs related to in-flight catering on the Middle East visit were unacceptable. My colleagues from the Royal Canadian Air Force and Global Affairs Canada will speak to this in greater detail, but I want to assure the committee that the situation is being addressed. There have already been changes, and we are all confident that these improvements will continue. Why is this important? Because face-to-face representation abroad is a vital part of any country's foreign policy. A key component of a Governor-General's responsibilities is to help the Government of Canada achieve its international objectives and further enhance its diplomatic relations. This includes facilitating global cooperation and dialogue, representing Canadian values and showcasing Canadian achievement, commemorating Canada's efforts and service, both civilian and military, to help people and regions in need, opening doors to trade, and delivering strong and important messages behind closed doors. But this is only ever done at the request of the Prime Minister and the Government of Canada. Dans les rares occasions,
on the rare occasions when Governor-Generals are invited to participate in events in other countries by non-governmental organizations, they only do so with the consent and approval of the government. We want to thank members of Parliament and the committee for raising these issues, as they have prompted a much-needed review of all related procedures and practices.
Future official international visits on behalf of Canada, the OSGG commits to working with our partner departments to add further structure and rigor to planning and coordination. In this way, we will ensure that decision-making is clear, approaches are reviewed and adapted, efficiencies are found, and flags are raised when required. This is a process of continuous improvement, one that takes time to achieve and will not be perfect from the beginning. But we are determined to learn from the past and to move forward with official visits where foreign policy objectives and outcomes are advanced in a context of careful, responsible, and robust stewardship of public funds. Je vous remercie.
I thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today, and I stand ready to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. McIntyre. Mr. Wheeler for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Honourable members of the committee, mesdames et messieurs. My name is Stuart Wheeler, and as Chief of Protocol of Canada, I'm pleased to join the committee again today alongside my colleagues to help clarify the processes used by our offices to fulfill our mandates and to reassure members of the committee of our shared commitment to the sound management of public funds.
As indicated at our last meeting, as Canada's Chief of Protocol, my office is responsible for managing the international functions of state protocol, including coordinating the logistics of high-level visits and related events. In all of our activities, the Office of Protocol is committed to transparency and accountability in the sound management of public funds. In this sense, the expenses related to high-level visits managed by my team are systematically published in the public accounts.
General plays an important role in international relations by travelling on state and working visits at the request of the Prime Minister to achieve specific objectives and deliver key messages. This is a practice that began before there were Canadian-born Governors-General and has grown over the decades since, as Canada has taken its place on the world stage. And this is a practice that is a standard and vital part of international relations among all nations, where visits are exchanged among countries at the highest levels to open doors and strengthen relations between international partners. Engagement at the level of heads of state provides an entree for conversations that are unique and that represent an indispensable tool in diplomacy, since in many countries they cannot be replaced by communications at the ministerial or diplomatic level. A visit by a Governor-General takes place when it is considered to be the most appropriate instrument to advance specific Canadian objectives in a particular region or country. Recommendations for visits are made by the Minister of Foreign Affairs to the Prime Minister through Global Affairs Canada and the Privy Council Office. Les visites des gouverneurs.
Governor-General visits strengthen relationships, advance key objectives, build bridges between people, reinforce Canada's image as a sovereign and unified country, and convey important messages for Canada to international interlocutors and audiences.
These visits, the Office of Protocol works closely with OSGG and occasionally with other departments, such as Veterans Affairs Canada, when visits include military components and commemorations, for example, or Sport Canada when they include events like the Olympics or the Pan Am Games, and always in partnership with Canadian embassies and high commissions abroad. Visit budgets cover mainly delegation travel, accommodation, transportation, and programming expenses, as you will have noted in your review of the invoices for the visit to the Gulf region. In this context, allow me to speak in a bit more detail about that specific visit. The UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait are important strategic partners for Canada in the Gulf region. From a bilateral perspective, the Governor-General's visit to these countries served three core objectives: to express Canada's sincere appreciation for the extensive diplomatic and military support Canada receives from these countries, including for our evacuations from Afghanistan.
To demonstrate the importance of this relationship through face-to-face discussions and engagement at the highest level, as well as a visit to Expo Dubai, which included a speech at the celebration of Canada's National Day at Expo to host country leaders, representatives of Expo nations, and the public on the importance of diversity and inclusion, human rights, and gender equality.
And finally, to reinforce other priority issues for Canada, including regional peace and security. We have asked all three of these countries for assistance with events and operations across the Middle East region and beyond in the past, and will almost certainly need to rely on these partners again in the future. In the context of the current crisis in Ukraine, this visit took on additional importance. Canada recognized the imperative of engaging key partners to build global consensus concerning Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. In all three countries, the Governors-General's discussions broadened Canada's outreach beyond our traditional like-minded partners as the government worked to manage and mitigate the effects of the crisis across many sectors.
In conclusion, the Office of Protocol is confident in its knowledge and application of the highest standards of public probity in financial management.
Look forward to continuing to work with our partners to refine our collaborative processes and continue to find efficiencies and savings as we deliver our important mandates. Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Happy to answer any questions members may have.
Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Ms. Kwan, please, for 5 minutes, and welcome to OGGO.
Thank you. Good morning. Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee, I am pleased to join you today to assist in your study and consideration of expenses related to the Office of the Secretary to the Governor General for its representation activities abroad. My name is Melanie Kwong, and I'm the Director General of Major Events, Commemorations, and Capital Experience at the Department of Canadian Heritage. My department has a statutory responsibility for state ceremonial and Canadian symbols as laid out in the Department of Canadian Heritage Act. Le cérémonial d'État.
State ceremonial consists of Canada's practices of planning, organizing, and holding official or public ceremonies involving the participation of dignitaries. The State Ceremonial and Protocol Directorate within Canadian Heritage assumes this official function for the Government of Canada. Its mission is to promote and protect our national symbols, provide expertise on domestic protocol matters, and assume a leadership role for domestic state events.
Events organized by Canadian Heritage take place in Canada. Examples include the installation ceremonies of Governors General, state funerals, national commemorative ceremonies, and other events of national significance. Canadian Heritage financial responsibility in relation to Governors General is limited to the period between when Governors General designate are appointed and when they are sworn in. This responsibility includes the coordination and execution of the installation ceremony. It can also include covering travel costs to the United Kingdom to meet with the sovereign prior to an installation ceremony. Dans la plupart des cas,
in most instances, the Governor-General designate will travel to London to be received by the Sovereign shortly before taking office. Travel arrangements are made through an agreement between the Office of the Secretary to the Governor-General and Canadian Heritage, which organizes the travel and defrays costs for this official visit.
For the members of the committee of our shared commitment to the sound management of public funds. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Kwan. General Kenney, welcome back. I'll hand things over to you for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, good morning. My name is Lieutenant General Eric Kenney, and I am the Commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force and Chief of Air Force Staff. As a senior Air Force officer in the Canadian Armed Forces, I am the advisor to the Chief of the Defence Staff on matters regarding air and space military capabilities to meet Canada's defence objectives. I'm happy to be here again today to answer questions that you may have regarding the Royal Canadian Air Force's role in providing air transport for the travel that is the subject of the committee's study. Sur demande,
upon request, the RCAF will provide safe, secure, and reliable air transport, including for the Prime Minister and Governor General. As a responsible steward of government finances, the Royal Canadian Air Force continues to look for ways to find efficiencies in the services it provides. Since I last appeared in September, my team has continued working with officials from Global Affairs Canada to identify efficiencies and to reduce catering costs associated with the transport of government officials. I am pleased with the progress that has come from our ongoing collaboration, which I anticipate will result in a reduction in catering costs moving forward.
Travel will continue to be subjected to high costs associated with aviation. This includes airport taxes, handling fees, as well as the services provided by airport catering companies globally. Nevertheless, the Royal Canadian Air Force will work in concert with our partner departments to implement changes where we can, with a view to maintaining the safety and security of our passengers. Merci de m'avoir permis.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today, and I remain available to answer questions you might have.
Thank you very much. And we'll finish with Mr. Duhem, please.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Bon matin aux membres du comité.
Good morning, members of the committee.
I'm the Deputy Commissioner of the RCMP's Federal Policing Program. I'm joined here today with Inspector Tarotan, the officer in charge of the Governor General's Protective Detail. As Deputy Commissioner of Federal Policing, the Protective Policing Program falls under my responsibility. This includes providing close protection services for designated officials, including the Governor General. Under the RCMP regulation, the RCMP is mandated to provide close protective services to the Governor General, both in Canada and abroad. The Governor General is provided with a level of close protection in line with the high-profile nature of the position. It is important to note that the RCMP is responsible for the close protection of the Governor General, but it is not part of the decision-making regarding travel plans or agendas. As such, the protective plan developed by the RCMP is based on decisions that are made by the Governor General's office. Protective measures are intelligence-led and are proportional to any threats and risk assessed by the RCMP in collaboration with external partners to ensure designated officials are provided with the protection that is appropriate and required.
The RCMP's assessment process relies on two central components, the threat picture and assessment of vulnerabilities. First of all, the RCMP intelligence units, in cooperation with external partners, draw up a threat picture of where the Governor General will be traveling. This general portrait includes three components: the threat context in the area in question, particularly potential threats against the event or the crime rate of this area, potential threats against the Governor General, and threats against Canadian interests, for example, because of international conflicts. Once the portrait has been established, the RCMP proceeds to an evaluation of the vulnerabilities.
Vulnerabilities consider several factors that include, but are not limited to, the protective measures offered by the host country. If it involves international travel and the accessibility to the general public at venues such as accommodations of the protectee in the event areas the protectee will frequent. Taken together, the threat picture and the assessment of vulnerabilities permit the RCMP to assess the overall risk and plan accordingly to ensure the safety of the protectee. Given the range of locations designated protectees may decide to travel to, costs can vary greatly depending on the details of the trip and the protective posture required to ensure the integrity of the protectee's close protection.
It's important to emphasize that members of the RCMP who assure protective services are considered as being traveling. Their travel arrangements are in accordance with the provisions of the National Joint Council Travel Directive.
Review of the global costs incurred by the RCMP in the provision of protective services to the Governor General since January 2014, including incremental salary costs and travel expenditures such as meals, incidentals, travels, and accommodations, was undertaken in advance of this meeting. This review shows a general consistency in the costs of close protective services provided to the past Governor Generals and did not identify any discrepancies that could not be accounted for. The only notable change occurred obviously in 2021-2022, but these variants are explained by the reduction of international travel, and I combine national travel as well due to COVID. Le contexte de la sécurité.
The security environment for public figures is constantly changing, both in Canada and abroad, and the RCMP will continue to assure professional and quality protective services to designated representatives. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today, and we'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Witnesses, thank you very much. We'll start with Kelly Block for 6 minutes, please.
Good morning, Chair, and thank you very much for the opportunity to ask some questions. I also want to thank our witnesses for joining us today, and I am sorry that I'm not there in person with you. I want to say at the outset that I am a monarchist. I truly do appreciate the role that His Majesty's representative plays, not only here in our country, but abroad as well. But I do believe that the expenses incurred by the Governor General and her office must be transparent and able to withstand the scrutiny of parliamentarians as well as Canadians. And so I guess my questions are going to reflect that belief. And the first question I have is, what was the total number of days for this trip?
Mr. Chair, Stuart Wheeler speaking. I'd be happy to answer that for the honourable member. The trip took place from March 16th to March 23rd, 2022. So a total of eight days, inclusive. And the members will have noted that there were expenses incurred during an advance visit earlier in December of 2021.
Okay, and thank you very much. What was the total cost for these 8 days?
I think in the production papers that we have supplied to the committee, there are amounts for each ministry. The total cost of the trip is in fact $1.147 million, and for my part at the in global affairs, the total that was charged against the budgets allocated to the Office of Protocol was $518,741.24.
So 1.147 million. Did that include the advance? Does that include the advance trip?
Yes, it does, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. I think I heard that in your testimony that it is ultimately the responsibility of the Prime Minister to determine when and where the Governor General travels. Can you again outline what were the specific objectives, policy objectives of this visit to the Middle East?
Yes, Mr. Chair and Madam Member, I'm happy to review those. There were three primary objectives. The first was to express Canada's sincere appreciation for the support that these three countries have all provided militarily and diplomatically to Canada in our operations in the region and beyond, particularly on complex operations such as the evacuations from Afghanistan. Second, Second was to demonstrate the importance of those relationships at the highest level by engaging in in-person discussions and conversations with the leaders of those countries. And finally, to reinforce other priority issues for Canada, such as regional peace and security.
Okay, I'm aware of a report that was tabled in 2004. The OGGO committee tabled a report. There were 6 recommendations, and of course, this report did not receive a response from the government due to the dissolution of Parliament in May of 2004, but they made some really important recommendations. Are you familiar with that report from 2004?
No, I'm not, Mr. Chair, but I'd be happy to look at the recommendations and provide feedback to the committee on notice as to how those recommendations have been included in operations and processes of the departments involved in this kind of travel.
So I'll just share with you one of the recommendations that I think...
Ms. Block, can I interrupt for a sec? Can you raise your microphone up a tiny bit for our interpreters?
Sure.
Thank you.
Is that better? Okay, one of the recommendations that I think was fairly important that I'll just put on the table here today is the one which was to remove the constitutional exemption of the Governor General from reporting to Parliament. I'm wondering if you could share with us your thoughts, initial thoughts on implementing this change.
Mr. Chair, I don't believe that is an area in which the Office of Protocol has a mandate or an official view, but I might turn to my colleague from Rideau Hall.
Thank you. I'd appreciate that.
Good morning. I would, as Mr. Wheeler mentioned, I would be pleased to come back to the committee with once having had a chance to to study more clearly the recommendations, but I can say that one of the things that our office has done since 2004 was actually produce and publish on our website an annual report that gives an overview of our activities and the costs involved in our department and our partner departments. This is publicly available, and this is a practice that we undertook, I think, in response to this, to that period in time, which I remember, I believe the 2004 appearance at the committee was with response to the Governor General Clarkson's visits abroad, if I'm not mistaken. But I would come back to the committee with more information.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Block. Ms. Thompson
Thank
for
you.
6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. I really appreciate that you've come today. And I think it's important, you've acknowledged transparency and accountability, and thank you for that. And I do think this is an important conversation. Ms. McIntyre, if I could begin with you, and again, thank you for also recognizing that some of the costs that we've seen are unacceptable. And to that end, if you could please speak to the discrepancy between the information that you were able to provide in September when you came to the committee last, and what we subsequently saw in media following that, where the food was more elaborate than what was indicated that day. So could you speak to that discrepancy, please?
Absolutely. So let me be clear, as I've said before, the costs of the catering were unacceptable. The comments made during the previous experience in September, they were based on my experience being involved with official international visits over many years, and that was giving an example of food that was served on the Middle East flight that was consistent with food that had been served on previous government flights that I had been on. I was not attempting to justify or normalize these costs in any way. I was trying to provide context to the committee about why, when learning about the costs of the visit, I was so surprised. The OSGG has asked our partners from the Air Force and Global Affairs, who are responsible for this process and make decisions regarding menus and procurement, to do everything possible to find efficiencies in the costs that we can control. As the General mentioned at the previous appearance, there are a certain number of costs related to catering that cannot be controlled, and he can speak further to that. We've also asked them to raise flags when required, and this is part of the improvements that have been made to the process since that time.
Thank you. And along a similar theme, and I realize the work of the Governor General's office is incredibly important, and increasingly so, if that's even possible, in a very polarized, increasingly polarizing world. But in light of the challenges many Canadian families are facing today in terms of rising food costs, and just general affordability, if you, Ms. McIntyre and Mr. Wheeler, if you could just address that for Canadians in terms of what is the media release after that September committee meeting in terms of the costs and the role of the Governor General's office and the work that's happening in light of perceived extravagance on a state visit.
So perhaps I can start in just reiterating that the Governor General and her office are not involved in any way in the procurement or the selection of the catering, but we have participated in this working group that has been set up by my colleague Mr. Wheeler and my colleague General Kenny, as the Air Force are the ones that are responsible for the procurements. And I would actually invite them to tell you about the work that they've been doing that we're very encouraged by, and actually encourage them to continue as much as possible.
Please go ahead. That was my next question. Thank you.
Before passing it to the General to comment as well on that improved processes that we've put in place, I just want to reiterate that our office works with the offices that you see here to deliver and secure the logistics of Governor General travel abroad, because the Governor General plays an important role in international relations. And when the government and the Prime Minister, on behalf of the government, requests the Governor General to travel abroad, it is to achieve specific objectives and advance key messages that Canada is pursuing on the world stage, and that Canadians can be sure are advancing Canada's objectives of facing some of the global challenges that are having an impact here at home as well. The Office of Protocol, for our part, is committed to transparency, and as I mentioned, we routinely release through the public accounts all of our spending and follow all Government of Canada financial procedures. While we work closely to deliver these visits, it is of course we're always able to improve our processes. We recognize that the system that we had in place was not delivering the kind of oversight and control that Canadian taxpayers deserve, and so we're here to assure honourable members that we are committed to improving it, and in fact have put in place a number of improvements already. What's really important to remember is that we are empowering our teams now to be working together to create a no-nonsense environment where they are flagging routinely any exorbitant costs that are put forward by caterers or other suppliers, so that alternate choices can be made, and we can make decisions to forego standard elements that we may have had in the past taken. So we are committed to identifying and implementing cost savings, and we have been working together over the last couple of months, our teams, at identifying very specific outcomes that will change the variable parts that Ms. McIntyre referred to, where we are able to control those costs. And General, if you have some specifics you'd like to mention.
I think on the next round, though. Thanks, Ms. Thompson. Mrs. Vinola for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My first question will be to Mr. Kenny, Ms. Wheeler, and Ms. McIntyre. When we saw each other in November, none of you was able to give us clarifications on the costs other than the total cost, which was surprising. So in the following days, the newspapers were revealing costs to us that were extraordinary. And we're talking about the equivalent of $565 for ice cubes, $110 for 4 liters of apple juice, and the equivalent of $556 for lemons and limes. So how is it that you were unable to inform us while the papers found that out before us? That's really surprising. I'll begin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. I can answer in English, please.
So since the intervening period, since we met in September, we have looked at all the costs associated with catering specifically, to your question. There is 5 components that make up catering costs, and I'll just go through them very quickly. The first one is the meal cost itself, which is...
Je m'excuse, c'était pas la...
I'm sorry, that wasn't the question. How is it that the papers found out before you, apparently? I can't explain that. You should have been aware, it seems to me, and perhaps it's just in my mind, but you should have been able to tell us before the newspapers knew. I don't understand what the process is that you were not aware and that the media was.
Question. Merci pour la question, Monsieur Président.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chairman.
Some of the information was released as part of access to information, which was made available to those that requested the information. My role is to be as transparent as I can be to the committee about what I know at the time as I provide you the information. Since we have met, I've learned a lot more about the costs that go into catering, and I'd be happy to share some of those details. It was never our intention at all to deceive or provide you false information. It's just that some additional information has come out since then.
Merci.
Thank you. I'll turn to Mr. Wheeler. In the documents that we received, I just have a part of it here. We can see that it was necessary to send a 12-person team, is that correct, in December 21 to the Middle East in order to do the advance work for the trip? My question, given that I'm not in protocol, are embassies not able to do part of this work? Is it not part of their responsibilities to do that sort of preparation? Why would it require 12 people? Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Ms. Vignola for the question. Advance trips are a critical component of a visit for a high-level delegation as we are traveling to countries where we need to meet and have formal meetings with officials of the country in question. We, during these trips, have people from the protocol group and from the OSGG. We have representatives of the RCAF who would be responsible for the planning of the actual plane travel for the official group, and also members of the RCMP to have meetings with their counterparts who would be responsible for security in the air place. So these are roles that are assisted by our teams in the region, but these are discussions that are held directly with the people who are responsible with their counterparts. Well, I can understand that the RCMP needs to be present in order to be able to visit the areas that may be problematic or where there could be some threat to the Governor General and the people traveling with her. But in terms of protocol, the Secretariat today, it's wonderful. I mean, we have technologies. Would it not be possible to have virtual meetings for purely diplomatic meetings, or does it absolutely have to be in person? Well, from the outset of the planning, we use more and more virtual communications in order to be able to accomplish many of the planning tasks that would have been done in the past either by email or by phone, and that helps us certainly to move the planning forward for the visit. But when we organize a visit at this level with several different options will be put forward by the embassies on site, and the group traveling will have meetings in person to see the different options that will be presented in order to best understand the distances involved for the travel, and also to carry out negotiations with the companies with whom we will be dealing for supplies. So there is a complexity of tasks that require visits and high-level in-person discussions. Thank you.
Time. Mr. Johns, we'll go over to you for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for being here and for testifying today. I think I really just want to start with, with inflation at levels not seen in decades, many Canadians have been forced to cut back on food. In fact, 1.5 million Canadians are using food banks right now. And we're also seeing, growing distrust of our public institutions. And against that backdrop, it's concerning to see public funds being spent on high-end meals like the $2,660 on beef Wellington, or extremely inflated items, $170 for sliced lemons or $565 for ice cubes. Maybe can you speak about how these expenses might breed distrust in our public institutions? I'll start with Mr. Wheeler.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and the honourable member. When we heard from you on, when we spoke with you on September 22nd, we had already begun some work at identifying exactly those drivers that were responsible for some of those costs, which we too found exorbitant and unnecessary. Our teams have been working closely with the Royal Canadian Air Force, and we've implemented the following cost efficiencies that I would point out. There will be no longer any choice of meal for passengers in the main cabin, which will produce for us significant reductions in overage, i.e. the total number of meals ordered for a flight. Meal selections will be sourced as is from caterers' menus with no requested changes as we determined through this process, and for that we thank you for bringing these things also to our attention. That those discussions with a caterer, often without knowing what the caterer was going to charge us for final changes because of the nature of some of those catering restrictions that we face, were causing undue increases. We have decided as a policy that snacks will be minimal and soft drinks and snacks will be sourced in Canada, likely in Trenton, so that we can take advantage of bulk purchases here and store them on the aircraft, so that we're not using catering services for those purchases, for example. Things that would be normally part of standard international air travel, such as ice, drink garnishes. We'll be looking at all of those costs as well, and certainly drink garnishes will be eliminated from service. Disposable cups will be used in the main cabin to minimize cleaning costs that we cannot control. And those are among just a number of the changes that have already made and are already producing savings.
I appreciate that. Now, were you aware, what the government would be charged for ice cubes and lemons, and was any effort made to negotiate or renegotiate these costs either before or after the trip?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I'll take that one. So the reality is with global catering services right now, it's actually quite difficult, as I expressed last time on the 22nd of September, to get quotes in advance of these catering contracts. So as one example, as we flew the Prime Minister and many Governor Generals and former Prime Ministers for the Queen's funeral to London, as we reached out to get catering costs, we were told for operational reasons that the caterer could not provide us those costs because of the high volume of people coming in at that time. And so we, in this particular case, received the receipts and the costs after the fact. This is not the policy we wish to use. We are working with all the catering companies to ask them for the quotes in advance, but we do not always get that, unfortunately.
I do appreciate that, sir. Now, is the working group that has been established focused solely on controlling costs for in-flight catering, or is it looking at ways to control other travel-related costs, like vehicle rentals, communications, and, there's other costs related to travel?
Mr. Chair, happy to take that question. Thank you for the question of the honourable member. The Protocol Office puts in place systems and communications with missions on the ground at the start of the planning of any visit, and we arrange for our missions on the ground in the regions to provide standard processes for government procurement that include multiple competitive bids from suppliers for all hotel, transportation, and other hospitality and services supplied. And that process will continue. And of course, in an era of increasing need to recognize the constrained finances of everyone dealing with inflation and other pressures on our budgets. This will continue to be an important thing in the top of minds of our officers.
Thank you, Mr. Johns. Thank you, Mr. Wheeler. Over to you, Ms. Kusi, for 5, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses for being here today. Merci pour être ici aujourd'hui.
Thank you for being here today.
Does Global Affairs still complete country strategies at missions, like every mission completing their own country strategy?
Yes, there is. Sorry, thank you for the question. Each mission, as part of our annual planning process, there's an online tool you might recall called Strategia. I think it was being tested when the honourable member was a member of our diplomatic corps. And yes, I do believe that it's still an annual process through which overall strategies for each country are established by the mission in discussion with headquarters.
Thank you very much for that response. Is there a section specific to events and hospitality within the country strategy? In the revised version.
Sorry, for events and hospitality.
Correct. Like in determining country strategies, then you would roll out sort of the activities that you would have in mind to meet the strategies, and then perhaps another line for events. I was just wondering if events and hospitality were part of the country strategy.
I haven't myself been involved in the strategic process for a number of years, but from my recollection at Post, there is the possibility when seeking specific funds for specific activities, whether that's a public affairs activity, a trade promotion activity, to include costs related to events and hospitality within that planning. But the planning of high-level visits is not part of that planning.
Okay, thank you. And that was my next question: is if missions share the costs of Governor General visits.
Sorry?
If missions themselves share the costs of Governor General visits.
The costs of visits by high-level
high-level individuals,
dignitaries, whether the Prime Minister or the Governor General, are borne by my office, and we release all of those figures through the public accounts.
Okay. When the previous administration implemented the Deficit Reduction Action Plan, do you recall specifically what the implications were for the protocol department? For example, in Dallas, I had to remove 10% of the budget. Was there something similar at the time? Do you recall?
I'd be happy to take that question on note. I wasn't working in protocol at that time, so I would be unable to say.
Okay, thank you. Prior to the end of the fiscal year, is protocol or our missions able to make purchases or invest costs for the following years to be used for hospitality or events in particular?
Funds that are allocated for a given fiscal year are designed to be used for that fiscal year. Through the monthly process of reviewing budgets, all divisions and directorates at headquarters track their spending and how it's tracking towards the expected expenditures of the plan for that year. And if there are additional funds, they are released earlier in the year so that we meet revised targets and don't have excess funds that perhaps you were referring to.
Okay, thank you. Is there any aspect of head of mission performance that is tied to expenditure review?
Through the monitoring of the monthly budget allocations for a mission or for a bureau at headquarters. There is at the 7th or 9th month, depending on the year, an attestation by the head of mission or the Director General responsible for that budget, in which they commit to the proper planning and implementation of the budget figures that have been laid out for them, and that is and coming in with within a certain percentage of that is part of what is included in performance management agreements of all senior executives at Global Affairs.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Kusi. You had 3 seconds to spare. Thanks very much. Mr. Housefather, for you for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I am going to come back to a question that was asked by Ms. Vignola because I don't think I got an adequate answer to it. Last time this group of departments was here to talk about the expenses, you told us that you didn't have the invoices. Yet that very same day, later in the day, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation was able to deliver to newspapers these invoices. Can somebody explain how none of you were aware that your departments had already accumulated these invoices and responded to an ATIP request with the actual information, please?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. On 22 September, when I was here, what I stated was I didn't know the detailed breakdown of the costs by meal. We did have the invoices at the time, and when you look at the invoices, you will see some of them have breakdowns of the cost by meal, and others just have an overall cost for catering with zero breakdown. So what I was trying to explain at the time is that it was difficult to provide an exact cost by meal, by location.
But if you had that information, sir, why did you not provide the invoices to the committee the day you appeared? If you had the invoices previous to your first committee testimony, why did you not provide those invoices to the committee so the committee would have had the benefit of them? Why did you believe it was okay that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation received them before parliamentarians?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. So at that committee, it was asked on notice that we provide that information, which we did provide last month for the committee to review, that had been previously subjected to an ATI as well, as you mentioned. Thank you.
I'm asking maybe if somebody else can give a better answer to this. We have multiple departments there. I'm sure all of you were equally embarrassed to see the information that you came to testify about in detail in the press with information you couldn't provide to parliamentarians. Has there been some accountability? Has there been some discussion between departments to go back to defense and ask them why this happened? Mr. Wheeler, perhaps, could you expand on that?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair, and recognize the question from the honourable member. We endeavour at all times when access to information material is being provided to requesters, whoever they may be, to fulfill their responsibilities under the Access to Information Act. And when it's possible, we do make efforts to consult among departments who are affected by or have been involved in events that are being referred to in access to information. As you will have seen, the invoices that were released under that access to information were only part of the larger production of papers that the committee requested, and as the committee was very generous with us to allow us additional time because of translation, because of the volume of detailed invoices, I think it's quite it's understandable that the details of all of those invoices that later were released would not have been at any of our fingertips on the 22nd of September.
I mean, I'll go to another question, but I do believe that it is unfortunate when parliamentarians ask departments to come to answer very specific questions about a Governor General trip, that there is information out there that's being provided to a third party before it's provided to the parliamentary committee that's asking for it. And I don't think that's okay. I'd like to come back to your comment Mr. Wheeler, that now in the main cabin, the menu is as is. Does the main cabin mean everybody on the plane, or is there a first class cabin that would have a different meal plan?
Thank you for the question, sir. In fact, the main cabin referred to the majority of the people traveling on the plane. There is a cabin in the front of the plane where the Governor General or the dignitary being transported and their family members may be seated. And the procedures that we've set in place will choose off the menu standard options. We will choose them based on cost and ensuring that we are meeting dietary restrictions of principals and any passengers that we see in having indicated. So there will be a choice between two standard menu items for the principal passenger, and beyond that cabin, there will not be choice.
So I'm
sorry, Mr. Housefather. We'll have to come back to you.
No worries. I'm flabbergasted. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I think we share some of that, Mr. Housefather. As we've done recently, I'm going to combine, if the committee's fine with it, we'll combine the block and NDP sessions into 1 5-minute each. So you're up, Mrs. Vignola, for 5.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'll come back to the preparation. The people who've gone to the Middle East, will they fly commercial for the advance or with using the same services that the Governor General would use? The travelers who are doing advance trips travel commercial, and they follow all of the directives of the Treasury Board. So are we talking economy or business class? Well, according to the trips, we follow the Treasury Board guidelines. And in some cases, if the trip is of a certain duration and you have to work upon arrival, the traveler may indeed be traveling business class. But it's certainly not always the case, depending on the availabilities. Well, we were talking economy or business class in this case? Well, for the long flights, that is to say Toronto, Qatar, for example, yes, that would have been a business class normally. And I don't know for some of the people. We spoke last November when we met that there had been a committee working group to decrease costs. And I had said at that point in time that it wasn't the first time that the Governor Generals had expenses that were quite surprising. And I was disappointed that such a working group hadn't been set up a long time ago. And it should be the usual thing to do to be careful of expenditure. So how many times has this group met since it was set up? Thank you very much for the question. It's an important facet of our activities now. The working group has met several times. They met before our appearance in September, over the course of the summer, reviewing the issues of what the factors are, etc. And afterwards, in terms of working, I couldn't tell you how many times, but I would probably say in the dozens. And in our office, we have met with groups to present different options, and following that to confirm and approve the list that I mentioned earlier of the methods that we would use to find efficiencies. At the end of the day, who is responsible during a trip of the acceptability and reasonableness? So it's not a person in particular, but which department ultimately is responsible for that of the cost, that they are acceptable. Who can say? Is there a process that, I don't know, if somebody says, listen, beef Wellington, do you really need that? Because that's far from ordinary. I don't know for yourself, but I've never eaten that. And I think that most Canadians wouldn't say that's supper tonight. So there's anybody who says that's not reasonable, we have to do something else. Thank you very much for the question, because I think that really goes to the heart of what we are talking about here today and what we were talking about before. What we want is for all members of our teams who work together to have that kind of motivation to always challenge and ensure that exorbitant costs are systematically pointed out, so that in each sector, because in my budgets it would be me who would have that responsibility for the proper management of the funds that have been allocated for what I'm going to do as the chief of protocol. And in other departments, their managers would have that responsibility. Okay, a question. If this hadn't come out in the press, would we even be having this meeting today? And would there be a review process? Honestly, as I said, it's not the first time that governors general have been the subject of questions about the costs they've incurred. And if it hadn't come out the way it did, would there be a process? I think what's important is that we all have a duty as public servants to always seek transparency and proper management of public funds. And when we take on a new job, we have budgets, and it's up to all of us to do that kind of review. And I would have hoped that, yes, in reviewing these exorbitant costs, we would have indeed taken the steps. And Ms. McIntyre.
Mr. Johns, please, for 5.
Yeah, so I'm going to stay on that, actually. Mr. Wheeler, I think Ms. Vignola asked some pretty direct questions there. And I guess my question is, do you believe that Canadians deserve more transparency about the activities and expenses of the Office of the Governor General? And if so, how might that be achieved?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the honourable member for the question. I can tell you that the Office of Protocol is committed to transparency and the sound management of funds, and everything that we spend for high-level visits is regularly released through public accounts, not in addition to being requested through a variety of OPQs and access to information requests. So I'm very proud of the fact that our office is very transparent with
do you think you're going to do more now that we've gone into this depth of this study and to ensure, that the public has a better understanding of where those expenses are? And I guess back to Ms. Block, she talked about in 2004 that the committee tabled the report with recommendations about the government's role in funding. However, there wasn't a government response because Parliament was dissolved. I know you didn't read the report, but do you think there's value for this committee in re-examining this issue to make recommendations that reflect Canadians' expectations 2 decades later? Or has anyone there read the report and maybe wants to respond?
Mr. Chair, Mr. Johns, I think, as I mentioned to Ms. Block, we will be going back to that report from 2004 to look at those recommendations. But what I wanted to talk about is that this kind of ongoing review of all that we do. We shouldn't need, what we're trying to do going forward is to ensure that we don't wait for a report or a committee or something to be able to look at these things, that we continually review our processes, that we do it on an ongoing basis, that it becomes part of everything that we do, and we look at options that will not necessarily be the same response in each situation. But just the fact of having those discussions, looking at ways, trying to find efficiencies, developing a system where people are encouraged to raise flags, this is all what we are committed to doing going forward.
I appreciate that, and that's the answer we were hoping for. I'm going to give my remaining time, as I agreed with Ms. Vignola, to pass on to her. Thank you very much.
You have 2.5 minutes, Ms. Vignola.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johns. Ms. McIntyre, quickly, when you came on November 22nd, you said that you had eaten something ordinary, and I emphasized earlier that this beef Wellington is far from an ordinary dish. I don't know about yourselves. As I said, for myself, it's far from an ordinary dish. I could see the ices. I saw $565 for a few pounds of ice cubes. And you said that the lemons and limes, either you wouldn't have any more or you'd bring them directly from Canada. I could also see portable freezers that cost some $3,000. I don't know if that's dollars or the currency of Kuwait or the 0.37 per dollar, and the other is different. But I saw 113,000 units of their currency that cost 444 Canadian dollars. So none of this is an ordinary average. So how will you ensure that in future it truly will be ethically responsible? Because here we have the impression that in the end, this whole process of accountability has only happened is because you got caught red-handed. So I don't doubt your professionalism and your devotion. It's simply to ensure that this will never get a slap in the face like this again. As a parliamentarian who didn't get the answers except for through the papers, and as a person who's belt tightening, there's so much money that goes to people who are going to food banks in Quebec. Can I tell you that it's tough, it's difficult, and do you understand how difficult it has been? So how can we ensure that this will never, ever happen again?
And perhaps you'll have to get back to the committee in written form on that last question. Mr. Barrett for 5, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks to the witnesses for being here today. I filed an order paper question, and that inquiry of ministry triggered the response that triggered all of this. And so, if that wasn't in your briefing notes, you're welcome. But it is great to have the opportunity to have you all at committee today. That OPQ response that was submitted in April and brought this matter to light has caused us to examine this particular trip. And I appreciate that there are some changes that are being proposed and some that have been implemented. My question is about proactive transparency. So I appreciate that there's going to be mechanisms put in place to limit expenses. And I have heard in testimony today, or we have heard that the Office of the Governor General is not in any way involved in the catering, but on the invoices, it says that there are special requests for a sandwich for $53. And I would say that that's an impressive sandwich. It says singular. And there's a special request for salad for $271 Canadian. Having to eat a salad is one thing. Paying $271 for that punishment is something else. These must be quite remarkable dishes. But the order paper question and the access to information request that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation discussed and released are, it's important that we were able to get information through those means. What is the Office of the Governor General prepared to do on a go-forward basis to proactively and transparently publish their expenses for trips like this? Of course, respecting security concerns and the individual privacy of the people involved. But, for example, members of the House of Commons, there are itemized disclosures of their expenses published quarterly. Would it not be easier to put in place a system where this is the practice for Rideau Hall than to have to examine invoices and publish those and translate those as they come up, and for all of you folks who do important work to then have to appear at committee to discuss it because that's not what was done?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. These visits, the costs of these visits are actually already released, as Mr. Wheeler has described, through public accounts through the Office of Protocol, who is responsible for the procurement, the accountability, the contracts. And in terms of, and that includes travel, that includes many of the elements that you've talked about today, sir.
With respect, ma'am, the detail is lacking. Otherwise, we wouldn't have submitted an order paper question, and we would not have seen the responses from the access to information requests as revealed by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. The level of detail is lacking, and that's where we found the unacceptable costs.
Sir, I would refer to my colleagues from Global Affairs and from the Royal Canadian Air Force, who are the ones who are the contracting authorities and responsible for these costs. So I will share the floor with my colleagues, sir.
So the question is about transparency.
Absolutely.
So the expenses are incurred for the Governor General to execute on her responsibilities, and her responsibilities are important. The detail that is lacking in the information that's available through public accounts is, as we've seen, not acceptable to the public. What steps are you collectively prepared to take so that on an ongoing basis, these improved measures that you're taking to reduce costs are reflected in a publicly available, proactively disclosed document?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the honourable member. As Ms. McIntyre has indicated, our standard practice is currently to proactively release all of the spending per visit for every visit undertaken abroad by and paid for by the Office of Protocol. It does have a breakdown, so you can see the amount spent for accommodation, for transportation, et cetera, and we will, of course, continue to do that. We, as we've mentioned, the General and I have a committee that's been set up to look at the specific questions that were raised and for which we were able to see that the system in place wasn't sufficient for the oversight of some of those exorbitant costs related to catering, and we have addressed those and will address them going forward, and we'll continue to make those savings on behalf of Canadian taxpayers.
Thanks, Mr. Barrett. Over to Vancouver, Mr. Baines. To you for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to our witnesses for joining us. There's a lot of disturbing, testimony here on some of these costs, and I'm just as surprised as Madame Vignola on the beef Wellington. I've never even seen it except for maybe on TV somewhere, and I'm a little bit encouraged by the fact that there's some changes that are taking place and some actions being taken place on eliminating some of these things. But my first question to Mr. Wheeler, can you confirm if there are post-trip reviews to determine how the final costs compare with pre-trip budget submissions?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair and the honourable member. Yes, when all of the final invoices come in from the various missions, Canadian missions abroad, from the various suppliers and contractors, and are paid by our office or by other ministries that are involved in the delivery of a visit, those are then recovered by the appropriate ministry and the appropriate budget, and so there is a final accounting of an entire visit, and for those that are covered by the Office of Protocol, as I mentioned, those are proactively released through the public accounts, and it does take sometimes a matter of months before all of those invoices and those various journaling between ministries happen. But yes, we do look at the overall cost, and I approve the public proactive release of that under the public accounts.
And just to sort of continue a little bit on that, like after that review of those costs are done, like has there a cap ever been considered? A price cap on what it should be set based on an acceptable average?
I think the important thing to remember is that the Governor General is being asked on behalf of the government to achieve important foreign policy objectives by international travel. The amounts for any given visit can range quite considerably depending on the locations visited, the complexity of visit, the level of the visit, whether it's a working visit or a state visit, whether there's a delegation traveling with the Governor General that often includes parliamentarians, ministers, and prominent Canadian experts who are chosen to come and support the Governor General and assist in advancing Canadian priorities in a given country or location. And so there are so many factors it would be very difficult to suggest that an international trip by the Governor General would need to fall into a certain package, but I can say that the overall costs are covered by my office in an amount which is established by the Treasury Board and the federal budget, and we work very hard to make sure that we are managing soundly those funds so that there are funds available to support the required transportation and visits abroad by those dignitaries. I can reassure the honourable member that the costs for this visit, while we have uncovered some exorbitant costs, which we hope to bring down in the catering section of the invoices that were released. I can reassure the committee that the overall cost of visits of this visit was in line with similar costs for high-level visits of this nature in the past.
Okay, thank you. And my next question to
Actually, I'm afraid that's your time, Mr. Baines.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Block for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Wheeler, in response to Mr. John's questions, you acquiesced to the need for more frugality during a time when Canadians are having to make very real and very hard decisions on how they are going to make ends meet. And I would suggest and even expect that this should be a goal of our government, not just during an inflationary crisis, but always to ensure that taxpayers are getting good value for the money that is being spent. I would think that should be the culture of a government, to be ensuring that they are spending Canadians' money wisely. My colleague highlighted the special requests that were brought forward through an order paper question. I would also note that one of the items that was reported on was $250 for 1 liter of orange juice. That's 100 milliliters, so that's $62.50 for 1 glass of orange juice. It would appear that the price of orange juice has increased by 4 times since 2012. And I guess my question to you would be, are all people, staff, including the Governor General's staff, subject to ATIPs?
Happy to take the question, Mr. Chair. The question: are all members of the delegation or the staff traveling subject to ATIP? All public servants in our ministry, and I wouldn't speak for other ministries because there may be security implications or other reasons, but all protocol officers and officials of Global Affairs Canada are subject to ATIP, yes.
So it would be reported who perhaps made the special request for the $53 sandwich, or the $200 and some salad, or the $250 for a liter of orange juice. Would we get that level of detail?
Thank you very much for the question. I think it gives me the opportunity, Mr. Chair, to clarify a little bit the reference to special requests. In the past, menus that in our past appearance before the committee, we discussed a little bit the process where menus were chosen for various legs of flight between the General's team and my team to ensure that the menus were appropriate for the length of the flight, that it met dietary needs, etc. In the past, standard options from menus of caterers would be adjusted to meet some of those requirements. And through this process, we've learned that the mere fact of going back and forth with a caterer who is doing specialized catering has resulted in increased costs with every adjustment. So as part of the ongoing working group committee's work, we've identified that as a specific driver, which we're eliminating from our processes. And going forward, we will be choosing standard menu items off of budget. We will be ensuring where possible, where caterers are able to produce it, that those options come with price tags on them. We'll be choosing them based on cost-effective nature, and making sure that those standard menus aren't that no changes are sought to them to ensure that we don't have those things going forward.
Well, I echo many of my colleagues' comments here this morning that hindsight is 20/20, and I appreciate that you've made decisions to ensure that you understand the costs that are going to be incurred before a trip is taken, not after a trip is taken. Again, I think many Canadians, when they are planning a trip, they need to understand the costs that they are going to incur before they take the trip so that they can make wise decisions about the trip itself. So I appreciate that, and will end my time there, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Ms. Block. Mr. Kuzmierczak, please, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I've just been listening with tremendous intent and interest in the discussions here, and I appreciate all of the excellent questions that all of my colleagues around the table are asking, and those are the questions that Canadians are asking and want answers to. I want to go back to the different legs of the journey of the trip, and the trip begins on March 16th, if I'm not mistaken. And on March 16th, the group takes off from Ottawa, and I noticed the first expense there, March 16th, is a Tim Hortons expense, Tim Hortons coffee. There are 2 Take 12 coffees that were purchased for a price of $45.18. And that seems infinitely reasonable to me. And I just wanted to ask whether those coffees were used on the flight. Just curious, is that something that could be procured and then basically brought into the flight? If I can just get an explanation for that expense.
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I don't have the answer for you as to whether, as to who actually used or drank that coffee, but yes, we can bring the Tim Hortons onto the flight, specifically to your question, and it was the flight crew that went and purchased that through the flight steward.
Okay. Okay, so that seemed very reasonable here. 2 Take 12 canisters of coffee from Tim Hortons to bring on the plane. The next expense that I see is, again, the flight from Ottawa. I believe it's a flight from Ottawa to London, as I understand it. Looks like it's an overnight flight across the Atlantic. And I see a food expense of $3,689, which amounts to approximately, I believe you had 46 people there on that flight, if I'm not mistaken, including the guests, including the staff and the crew, which works out to about $80 per person there. And that's again, I imagine that's an overnight flight. Can you also explain, there's a $2,000 fee for wet and dry stores. Can you explain that to me or for me?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. I don't have the specific for you said wet and dry storage?
Yeah, it says wet and dry stores, $2,093. So you had about $3,600 for meals, and then you had an additional wet and dry stores, $2,000. I just wanted to understand what that means.
So that would be such things such as ice and other aspects to bring the food within, is my understanding at this stage. I don't have the other specific details. Okay. Apologize.
Okay, but for the meals, it looks like it's $3,600 for that leg of the flight from Ottawa to London, which works out to about $80 per person. I imagine that includes dinner and potentially breakfast on the flight over. But then we go to the third leg of the trip, which is the London leg. And all of a sudden we go from $3,600 for meals to what I see is $29,000 Canadian is what the cost was from London, the catering from London, England. And it's 15,000 pounds, British pounds, and that's $29,000 Canadian. Can we sort of explain a little bit how we went from sort of, again, ordering Tim Hortons to Take 12 canisters and paying $3,600 for food from Ottawa to London, and then in London, all of a sudden, we're paying 4 times more, $29,000. Can you explain that cost, that increase in cost for that leg?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Chair. As you were highlighting, there is different costs depending on where we go. In many cases, there's costs that we can control. In some cases, there's costs that we cannot control. We're often found with only one caterer that's available that meets the standards that we require and the health and safety requirements for those that are on board. As per any cost, what we find is there's 5 factors. There's the cost of the food, which is the protein, which is typically between $23 to $90 total. There's a tray setup fee that goes on top of that, which is sometimes the same cost as the food. The tray setup fee includes the bun, the salad that you'll get, the small dessert that goes with it. Beyond that, there's food and snacks, which, as we highlighted, we're only purchasing now in Canada moving forward. There's also a component of what we call overages. So as described by Mr. Wheeler earlier, we're only buying 20% overage at this stage. We used to buy 65% overage. That gives that option for the front crew, as was mentioned, for the passengers. And then there's back-end fees that can be sometimes up to 20% And in this particular case, it was 50% of that particular leg were back-end fees. Back-end fees are handling and delivery, their storage, their cleaning and disposal of international waste, and taxes. When you add all that together, it all of a sudden becomes a much larger bill, as you've described. So we're always looking at value for money and making sure that we're going to caterers that will provide us the best value for money. I would also say, and as highlighted by Mr. Wheeler, going forward, we're not going to be working with Global Affairs Canada, any changes to the menus that are offered by the caterers. That's really going to drive down, we believe, the prices. But there is certain things that we will not be able to control. Some of those things are the back-end fees I described and the tray setup fees.
Great. I'm afraid that's your time, Mr. Kamirchuk. We actually went over about a minute. Ms. Kusi for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. We've mostly been talking about food, so I'm just going to go back to some of the Library of Parliament questions, which I think were very worthwhile, which aren't related to food. It says here, the Global Affairs invoice summary notes, and I should also add my colleagues have made reference to them, but no one has asked them specifically, notes charges of over $40,000 in vehicle rentals for a trip to Abu Dhabi, as compared to $25,000 for rentals in Doha and $17,000 for rentals in Kuwait City. Can you explain why the car rentals for a canceled trip are higher than those in the cities in the cities that the delegation visited? And this one's particularly interesting to me because I actually thought that this was from Schedule 3 of the public accounts, but now that I reflect upon it, I think that was actually an expense tied to national defense as opposed to global affairs, but I thought it was a good question anyway, please. Mr. Wheeler.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question from the honourable member, and thank you, Chair, for the opportunity to explain that a little bit. There, you make reference to costs attributed to the stop in Abu Dhabi. At the time the visit was first being planned, and accounts were being set up within our SAP accounting system, a stop in Abu Dhabi had been envisaged in order to meet the President of the UAE. When the final program was finalized, the meetings with Emirati leadership were held in Dubai, not in Abu Dhabi. So we dropped the leg to Abu Dhabi, and all of the costs that had been for services retained there were transferred and used in Dubai. So there were no sunk costs lost on a quote-unquote canceled trip to Abu Dhabi. Simply those transportation costs that were contracted with a service provider in Abu Dhabi provided those in Dubai as well. The visit to the United Arab Emirates was longer than the visit to Qatar that you're referring to, and that would also account for a difference in price between those two legs of the visit.
Thank you for that. And I was trying to recall if how sunk costs are budgeted or recorded. I'll have to go to back to my books, I guess. The same way that I was trying to recall from the last round, the process for applying products with the accrual method. I'll go on then to the question 9 from the Library of Parliament then. It says the National Defence invoices list roughly $26,000 in satellite communications charges, and Global Affairs invoice notes over $10,000 in mobile charges for advance visit. How do these costs compare to communication costs for other advance and official visits? And I'll ask the second one at the same time. If there is a significant difference, what accounts for the discrepancy? I know certainly in the House of Commons, when we're going overseas, we have the opportunity to go on to other more cost-effective packages. So what would be the reasoning behind these costs then, please?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair and the honourable member. It actually allows me to clarify that in precisely in an effort to reduce costs for communication and keeping our team and our principal connected back to Canada and to each other during a visit, one of the tools we use are called mobile pucks. They are are a mobile Wi-Fi or a MiFi, which we have purchased in the Office of Protocol, and which allows us then to reuse them at every visit in the future. It allows us to avoid roaming charges, which many of us have noted can be very high, and particularly when traveling internationally. And it allows us then to make bulk purchases of cheaper SIM cards, which are then just added to these MiFi pucks. So in a number of the invoices, you'll see for Wi-Fi or mobile charges. That's what that refers to. And with respect to the question of comparability to previous visits, I don't have the level of detail for previous visits before me, but I can reassure the honourable member that we look at the situation in each country, the destination, based on what would the roaming charges be versus the cost of using the pucks that we have and taking them with us from Canada, and so that's always part of our effort to keep those costs under control.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Cusi. Mr. Jawari, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome to the witnesses. Probably I start with Mr. Wheeler. We talk about the cost of the trips for dignitaries in Governor General. Are these costs comparable when we are doing domestic, when the Governor General is performing domestic, let's say, visits as compared to the international or foreign visits?
Thank you very much for the question from the honourable member. I'd have to defer that question to Rita Hall, as the Office of Protocol is not involved in the Governor General's domestic travel.
Thank you, and thank you to the Mr. Chair and to the honourable member for the question. If I understand the question correctly, are the costs for domestic travel within Canada comparable to international costs? And I would say that costs are dictated on the nature of the specific type of visit. Within Canada, the Governor General visits communities across the country upon invitation to visit bases, to present, to recognize Canadians for their efforts, both civilian and military, across the country, and would not typically take an Airbus or a large group of people. It's a small group that accompanies her. So I wouldn't say that, and it's all done within the budget of the Governor General's office for these particular visits. So I wouldn't say there's a comparison necessarily there.
Not compare the domestic cost of Governor General doing business with the international, because there are different players involved.
There are different players. There's different levels of security. Okay. My colleagues there, of course, could speak to that. There's partners that we work with when we're participating in these different activities. There are not as many ceremonial elements. When a Governor General is conducting a state visit, there are certain protocols that need to be followed. Okay. When the Governor General is visiting communities, she's greeted there in a very different way.
By its nature, then the overhead costs associated with planning Governor General domestic is much lower than the overhead cost of the Governor General. I'm looking at the number of witnesses we have. We have 5 departments coming in, presenting their testimonies here today for an international trip that happened. And I'm looking at, and I'm saying, yes, we're looking at the food costs, we're looking at transportation costs. What kind of overhead costs has the group of 5, as I call you now, has the group of 5 looked at the overhead costs and the complexity of planning these trips, whether the ratio of the overhead cost to the actual cost is justified?
Perhaps I can start by saying that diplomatic travel is a vital component of a country's international engagement strategy. The Governor General travels only at the request of the government, but the decisions with regards to these visits must always reflect the highest standards of stewardship. I think we are all in agreement with you there. And these visits have specific objectives in place to try to advance Canada's international strategy. Mr. Wheeler has spoke to you about that.
Yeah, Ms. McIntyre, I appreciate that. All I'm trying to make a point here is that there's an aspect of the cost when it comes to the total cost, which has to do with the overhead cost of setting this aside from the execution cost of this. And I don't have it, and I don't think that we as government don't have any idea around how much that overhead cost is. I don't know how many hours each one of members of your department spend on planning this. And if you multiply it by the average hourly rate of a public servant, I don't know. Does it come to 30,000? Does it come to 50,000? I don't know. And probably it wouldn't be a bad idea for your department to also look at that. I got only about 30 seconds. Are we setting up standards for international travel based on the category of the expense that we say, okay, from now on going forward, this is the category of spend, for example, fueling or for food, and if it's for VIP person is this much, and for an individual is this much. Any of those are being set, or just the budget are developed when we ask them how much it's going to cost, so we take it without challenging it and putting and developing a budget?
Just a brief answer, please.
I think what we're putting in place is an ongoing system where we're constantly looking for those savings.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Witnesses, thanks very much. I do have one question for you, though, and I want to quote Ms. Block. She talked about hindsight being 20/20. I think this is probably the third or fourth time in OGGO or other departments we've faced this, hindsight being 20/20, when nothing seems to change. And I think that's been reflected in a lot of the comments here today. I'm wondering if each of the departments represented today would put in writing and submit to the committee step by step what your plan of action is in plain basic language, please, not bureaucrat-ese, of what the departments are going to do to ensure that in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, there's not going to be another OGGO committee saying, well, 2020, again, that we're actually going to stop this issue from reoccurring. I would appreciate that. Colleagues, unless there's anything else, we will adjourn. Thank you, everyone.